Good morning. It is good to see all of you here this morning. If you're visiting with us, we are very excited that you are here. We hope that you stick around a little afterwards so we can get a chance to meet you and greet you a little bit before rushing off to lunch. I will let you know that I'm not the regular preacher here if you're visiting. Todd is away on vacation this week, celebrating 30 years of marriage, so we're very excited for him and excited to let him have that time. Some of you are probably okay with that because you know he would have some choice comments to make about the Ohio State game yesterday. So some of you are happy he's not here to laugh in your face. But I'm not a Purdue fan. I'm a Purdue fan. I won't say anything. But anyway, and just a quick other announcement. Don't forget that on the 24th here in just, 2 weeks, is our Knock the Walls Down Sunday. The one Sunday a year where we try our very hardest to get as many people in our building as possible for Sunday morning service. And again, Sunday evening. So please invite your friends, invite your family, invite your neighbors. We just wanted people to come here and hear the gospel, and so we try to pack the walls to knock them down. It's something Todd brought with him when he started here a few years back, and so the 24th is when that'll be. And you can tell your friends and family, if they're hesitant, that there will be food afterwards. A lot of fried chicken, a lot of potato salad that Todd will look forward to. You know, it'll be next door. So please join us for that. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 5. Verse 21. Mark chapter 5 and verse 21. I like Mark a lot and have preached out of it a few times here. I did the story actually right before this one a little over a year ago. And so this analogy is probably going to be familiar to you, but I'm a big sports fan. And as a sports fan, one of my favorite shows is SportsCenter. And SportsCenter is just this show that has a lot of highlights in it. It's the home runs, it's the dunks, it's the touchdown passes, and so it's the biggest and best moments. And to me, Mark seems a little bit kind of like SportsCenter of the Gospels. It kind of shows the highlights of Jesus' ministry. Mark was the first gospel written, and it's also the shortest gospel written. And so he doesn't give us quite everything that Matthew, Luke, or John might give us, but what he does give us is really good, these main points, these highlights, if you will. And he's always using the word immediately. I think he uses it 42 times in his small gospel. And so it reads kind of like Jesus immediately went here, and he immediately did this miracle, and he immediately told this parable, and immediately, etc. And so you see how it kind of goes a little fast and so on. But these aren't just like random thoughts that Mark has thrown in here. He's actually very meaningful and very purposeful as he tells us the story of Jesus. And oftentimes, his stories, they flow in a really nice pattern. He's really into the details. And so this story we're going to be reading today actually does flow in one of these patterns. It flows in a pattern of Jesus showing his power. First, Jesus has shown his power over creation and calming the storm. And then he shows his power over the spiritual realm and healing the demon-possessed man. And in this story, he heals the sick, and he also raises somebody from the dead. But in each of these stories, when Jesus shows his power, the crowd also reacts to that power. And so with that context in mind, let's go ahead and start reading here in Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she might be made well and live." And he went there with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. So let's pause there for a second, because we've been introduced to these two new characters, and it's important not to just rush on by what we've learned about them so far, but to sit and kind of absorb it for a little bit and let it sink in. And so first, we're introduced to Jairus, who we're told has a daughter who's at the point of death. And that's really a powerful statement. It's really a sad statement. Maybe if this was a TV show or a movie and we weren't just reading it, we'd relate to it a little better. Maybe it would sink in a little better. Maybe it's because we've heard this story so many times that we don't fully grasp how powerful that statement is. But if we read this story with fresh eyes, with new eyes, we realize how we can only imagine how much pain that Jairus is in. He slowly watched his daughter grow sicker and sicker until now she's at the point of death. And some of you may have experienced this thing, and I hope not. We don't want that, of course. But there are some people that I know who've experienced similar things, and in my discussions with them, It's just obvious how a parent in this situation would do absolutely anything they could to get their child out of this horrible situation, to help them and bring them about and give them healing. And so that's exactly what Jairus does in this story here. He does the unimaginable, believe it or not. He does the unimaginable and takes a huge risk. How? By going to Jesus. We don't really think of going to Jesus as a risk, or even as something that's hard to do. We think of, we read the Bible and we see all the crowds gathered around Jesus. We see his disciples following him everywhere. And it doesn't make sense that going to Jesus would be hard at all. But Mark also tells us that Jairus was a ruler of the synagogue, right? And what a ruler of the synagogue was he was the person who was in charge of a specific synagogue. He was the one who would assign people to do the scripture readings, to do the prayers. He would make sure that the synagogue had enough scrolls. He would invite rabbis to come in and teach. He would make sure there was no maintenance issues. Any maintenance issues would be his responsibility, and all these different things. And what we understand from history is that a lot of these rulers of the synagogues were also Pharisees. And so, in other words, he was a very important person in the Jewish faith, and he had a lot of status and roles in this honor. Now, stop and think and remember how the feelings of the religious elite in Jesus' time towards Jesus. They weren't exactly good, were they? In fact, in Mark, we're told that they decided they were going to kill him already like 2 chapters ago. And so, by going to Jesus for help, he was very clearly putting himself and his status at risk. By choosing Jesus, he was putting himself at a risk. But you can only imagine every day as he watched his daughter grow sicker and sicker, and he would continue to hear these stories about Jesus and how he would heal the sick and others, until he got to this point where he just couldn't take it anymore. It didn't matter if it meant he was going to lose his job. It didn't matter if he was going to lose his status. It didn't matter what his friends thought. All he wanted was the healing power of Jesus to restore his daughter and make her whole again. And so he comes, you can just picture him barreling through the crowd, pushing people over, coming to Jesus, finally coming to his feet, falling on his knees, and begging him to help his daughter. And this isn't the proper speech of an official, right? This is the plea of a desperate man in need of Jesus. And so Jesus, being a man of compassion, goes with him to his daughter. And as you'll see so often in Mark, the crowd obviously goes along with him. And on the way, we meet this woman. And this woman, like Jairus' daughter, was in need of Jesus' healing power as well. And while her situation might not have been as urgent, it was by no means less destructive. You look at all the emphatic statements here that Mark gives us, starting in 26. She had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. This wasn't a slight ailment for this woman. This was a disease that consumed her life and dragged her life down into isolation and desperation. She was brought into isolation because her disease and bleeding condemned her to being unclean. And I feel like every time I get up here to preach, there's always an unclean person in the story. I don't know why that is. But we've preached about, Jesus healing the leper. We've talked about the demon-possessed man and the unclean tombs. And so some of these are going to be familiar to you, but they're not going to be any less extreme, right? This woman was not allowed to live a normal life. She was unclean. Anywhere she sat or anywhere she laid down was considered unclean until it was washed. Anyone she touched was considered unclean until evening. Imagine the embarrassment in that. Can you imagine going through life where everyone you come into contact with is avoiding you and desperately trying not to touch you and dodging you when you walk by? Or when you sit down somewhere or go somewhere, like they won't follow after, almost like you have some horrible disease? Can you imagine living like that? The isolation that would cause for 12 years? And maybe worst of all, she couldn't even enter the temple. Under this condition, being unclean in the Old Testament law, she couldn't enter the temple in this time. So not only was she cut off from society, but she also felt like she was cut off from God. But thankfully, God came down to his people and destroyed this distance that man had made and made himself available to all, especially the hurting. Now, I said she was in isolation and desperation, and I think you can obviously kind of see the desperation here, but you can see it more so in the next few verses. So let's pick up again in verse 27. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Can you feel the desperation there? Right? The desperation that caused her to break these Old Testament laws. One, by going out in public in general. And two, by intentionally reaching out and touching someone. All in the hopes that she might just touch a piece, just the edge of Jesus' clothing. Thinking that maybe, just maybe, the stories she had heard were true. That just maybe she might be healed. Church, I pray that we have this same kind of faith. That when we experience isolation, that when we experience desperation, when the darkness comes and consumes us, when we don't think there's a way out of our misery, that we follow this woman's example and strive for Jesus. Even when it's unpopular, even when your friends and family mock you, even when you feel like it's too late and Satan's lying to you, telling you that it's too late to go, strive for Jesus at all costs. Even if you feel like you can just barely touch the edge of his clothes, because that is enough. Jesus tells her that it was her faith that made her well. It was this faith. This faith was the first step in overcoming her darkness. She had heard the stories, right? All the great things Jesus has done and was doing. But it wasn't until she went out, followed him, and reached out to touch him that she received healing. It wasn't until she went out, followed him, and reached out and touched him that she received healing. See, too many people in this world want to have faith and believe from the comfort of their couches, if you will, right? They want to say, yes, I believe, but they never want to go out. They never want to follow him. They never want to reach out and try to touch him. And then when the darkness comes and the bad times happen, they wonder where God is. It was her faith that when her faith was put into action was when her healing came. She only was healed once her faith was put into action. And notice Jesus here. He wasn't content to let her be healed, seek him momentarily, and then slip back into the crowd. Not at all. Once she put her faith in action and reached out and touched him, he and then turned to make a point of connecting with her and bringing her close and developing a relationship. She was no longer just one in the crowd, but she had come face to face with Jesus because of her faith. And that's important to see here. Faith in Jesus is knowing Jesus is so much more important than just being healed. It's so much more important than just being happy. It's so much more, I would say it's even so much more important than just being saved. It's about having a relationship with God and entering into his love. Salvation is the means to which you be freed from sin so that you can freely enter into that relationship eternally with him. That's what Jesus had in mind when he said, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are sitting there saying, "Gee, what do you mean, who touched you? You're standing in the middle of a crowd. Everyone's bumping into each other. Of course somebody touched you." And there's another disciple probably thinking, like, this must be a parable because it doesn't make any sense. About to take notes or something. But Jesus wanted to know who reached out and touched him in faith. And she comes up once he asked, afraid, because remember, she had broken some Old Testament laws. But Jesus here is stronger than those Old Testament laws. He doesn't rebuke her. He doesn't bring up her past. He instead calls her daughter and tells her that her faith has made her well, tells her to go in peace, and tells her to be healed of her disease. And then she goes out to live a restored life. But we're forgetting somebody here, right? What is Jairus doing through all this, right? Can you imagine his frustration trying to get Jesus to come to his daughter to save her life as she's at death's doorstep, and he stops in the middle of a crowd to ask who touched him? Can you imagine that frustration? And it's, can you just imagine that frustration on how he would feel in those same ways? And as Jesus says to the woman, "Daughter, your faith has healed you," Jairus' servant comes to him and says, your daughter is dead. And I don't think I can personally grasp that kind of pain, not being a parent myself, and I'm kind of thankful for that. I can't imagine his pain, his sorrow, his possible resentment towards Jesus for stopping in a non-emergency. He had risked his job for nothing, right? He had missed being by his daughter's side as she died for nothing. Or so he thought. But when you put your faith in Jesus, great things happen. Verse 35. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brothers of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why are you making commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went into where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. Do not fear, only believe. That was Jesus' command to Jairus. And because Jairus put his faith in Jesus and allowed him to fulfill his plans, he got his daughter back. An unrelenting and true faith in God is the start of some great things in our life, because faith is what opens the door and invites God in to do the unimaginable. Jairus didn't know what to expect when Jesus told him to believe. He didn't know what Jesus was going to do, but he was asked to expel the fear and to believe. You know, the darkness in our lives, the things that we don't feel like we can overcome, there's only one way to overcome those things. Do not fear, only believe. Where are the places in your life that need that healing power of Jesus? Where in your life do you feel defeated? Do you feel isolated? Do you feel desperate? What is driving you to risk everything you have to come into contact with Jesus? Where do you need that healing power of Jesus in your life? Or maybe your life is going well, almost hunky-dory, and you don't have anything specific, no specific darkness, no specific sin, which is a little hard to believe. But maybe, we go through good times in our lives where you don't feel like there's that thing pushing you to come into contact with Jesus. Well, maybe that's when you need to cling to Jesus the tightest, right? To strengthen that relationship, to grow closer to him while the waters are calm, so that when the storm comes, God's healing power is already present. How will God make things better? What is he going to do when I fully trust him? I don't really know. And I'm sure it would be different for all of us. If we did know, it really wouldn't be faith, would it? But I know that if we trust in him, it will be good. Now, don't misunderstand the message here. Putting your faith in God isn't going to get you out of debt. It's not going to get you a better job. It's not going to cure your chronic illness. But believing in him and placing your burdens on him and diving headfirst into faith and strengthening your relationship with God will only help you overcome each and every trial you face. I've thought a lot about the hurricanes that have come through Texas and now through Florida, the devastation, the deaths. It's easy to look at all that and be mad or to be hopeless. And those feelings aren't necessarily wrong, but they must first be rooted in faith. Must be understood in faith and to have faith to overcome those challenges. I pray that the people in these places like Jairus and like the woman that are affected by these tragedies might put their faith in God and to see his magnificent plan unfold even among all this darkness. Why this message is for the people who don't have faith yet and who haven't put their faith in God, it's just as much a message for all of us believers, because it's so easy to slip out of a mindset of total faith, isn't it? The things of the world are real. The things of the world come at us, and they distract us, and they cause us to lose our focus, and they cause us to lose our focus on Jesus and turn to other things. Not that we've lost faith, but that we've turned our focus from the hope to the fear. And this is our reminder to come back to Jesus and to lay everything on his shoulders. With Christ, there is no more defeat, there is no more fear, and there is no more death. In the same way that faith brought about the resurrection of this little girl, faith in Christ will one day bring about our resurrection as well. Do not fear, only believe. If you are here today and haven't yet put your faith in God, haven't yet put your faith into action through baptism, or if you simply need the prayers of the church, won't you come as we stand and sing?